This is Power 98.7. And now you're listening to Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. 9 a.m. to midday. Taking your calls on 0861 987 000.
Macheroni sanbonani bantwana benkosi. Good morning, goeiemôre, dumelang. This is indeed Power Talk with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. Back in the country, in the city of gold, Gauteng, Johannesburg. We're broadcasting here at Powerhouse. We are joined in this hour, and I'd like to make sincere apologies to the callers. Normally we dedicate this hour in conversation with the open line, but we have as a guest today the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Services, Mr. Edward Kieswetter. And welcome indeed, and thanks very much for creating time. We've been back and forth, as it were, trying to make this happen, and finally it has. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. And as I said, Bantwana Benkosi, this matter of collecting taxes is very, very, very difficult and consumes a lot of time. So the Commissioner could only make this first hour between 9 and 10. That's why we are stealing into the open line. But 0861987000 is our studio line. If you have a question for the Commissioner, we will take one or two questions for him. 0861987000. Our WhatsApp line 0833037093. If you are in Pretoria and Johannesburg, the frequency is 98.7. In Johannesburg South and West Rand 103.6, and for Vereeniging 104.4, in Ekurhuleni 107.2. You can also tune in and listen to the conversation through DSTV channel 889. I'm in a conversation with the Commissioner of Sars. It's been 6 years, if I'm not wrong, Commissioner. Since you took the helm.
6 years and 3 weeks.
You've been counting. Very good. You're not counting the taxes only, even the days of collecting this tax. What has been like, if you could maybe describe the situation that in your determination attained at the point of your appointment, and what are the key highlights over the last 6 years and 3 weeks?
I think it's a great question. When one considers the ambition of the state to build a capable state, then capability doesn't come about overnight.
Yeah.
It's often unglamorous work, and leaders are privileged to give direction to that work. And so when one is invited into such a privileged position, I am a scholarly or leadership reflective practitioner, so I always think deeply about, as you do, about what it is that one sets out to do. So the first thing was to deeply invest again into the legal mandate of SARS and to be unequivocally clear about what that means. And from there derives the authority of the institution, the authority of the office, and a commitment to oneself and to everyone else that you will do so without fear, favor, or prejudice. The institution has been created to be independent, specifically so that there's no interference by political or business elites. I started on the 1st of May by writing a letter to staff and to set out with clarity where I stood, where I thought SARS was, and how I thought we would work together towards that. So the letter makes 4 very specific points. The first is, this is how I feel about the state of SARS and why it became like that. You may not agree with me, but that's my interpretation. It was a victim of a misaligned leadership and, in fact, a corrupt leadership intent. And if you don't agree with me, then we must talk about it. The second was to be very clear what the organization could hold me accountable for and set that out. And then thirdly, what I thought I would hold every employee accountable for. And then lastly, if we could do that, what I thought we could achieve together. And so every year we go and measure those things and to see how we have progressed against it. Starting with strategic clarity, focusing on building deep leadership. And there were some leadership issues that one had to take head on and to do so early. Building an engaging workforce and to measure everything along the way. Where are we now? I don't think we can declare victory. But it is pleasing to say in the 6 years we have had compound annual growth rate of revenue of over 7% in an economy that has been struggling. Within that, a compliance revenue component, that's revenue that's directly related to the work we do, growing at over 17% on a compound annual growth basis. And of course, a voluntary compliance index that have gone up from the early 60% to over 65%. The soft indicators, though, are the ones that gives one a sense that you have achieved some level of capability building, because the scorecard is in the numbers, but the soft stuff often tells you more about an organization. So what are they? The first is that public trust in 2019 was 48%. Today it stands at over 78%.
And the source of this?
Independent surveys.
You don't know them?
I have a team that does it. I don't interfere with that.
It's internal independent surveys.
No. It's one of our executives are charged with conducting it. So they appoint the service providers, and I stay out of it.
I see.
The second is that public attitude towards compliance have gone from 66% to 77%. Our own employee engagement have gone from 61% to 71%. And
what
measured
is employee engagement?
So employee engagement, in essence, measures 5 things. 1, whether employees enjoy their work.
Okay.
Secondly, whether they understand the meaning of their work to the greater organizational mandate. The third is whether they know what they have to do to succeed. The fourth is whether they receive helpful feedback that helps them to succeed. And the fifth is whether they believe overall they have a fair deal. And so that's then transcribed into about, I think, 68 questions. And an independent service provider conducts the survey, interprets the results, and gives us the report. And the fourth indicator is, in 2019, against a service charter, the service level of Sars was 54%. Today it is well over 87%. So each of these indicators have increased.
Service charter. We're dealing with the public here,
Commissioner.
Not MPs.
There are no MPs in the room.
No, not today, not this morning.
So a service charter is the level of service the public can expect of us. So, for example, when you have submitted a return and you are selected by SARS for an additional verification, the service level agreement says we will conduct that. Our aim will be to conduct that verification within 21 days or communicate with you if that can't be achieved. If you submit an application for a voluntary disclosure, there's a turnaround time by which we will acknowledge and a turnaround time by which we will engage you. So it's a clear set of standards framed as a charter, tabled in Parliament, and we are held accountable by the public, by Parliament, and also it's against that service charter that a member of the public may escalate a matter to the tax ombud.
Okay. So, in your view, these have been the key improvements. Many people's assessment, of course, based on the Nugent Commission report, related to the general incapacitation of SARS for maximum collection of revenue, which obviously affects the state's performance, because 99% of what the state uses to deliver services lies with the capacity of SARS to actually collect. This 7% growth in revenue collection, of course, it seems to me that it's an indication that there's that improvement vis-a-vis the past. But it is in light of what level of target that you set for yourself?
So we don't...
what this economy is really capable of?
Yes. So there's a few indicators that are benchmarked by the OECD that gives an indication of a healthy tax system. One of it is the tax to GDP ratio. And South Africa has been around about 24-25%. And we think for an economy our size, it isn't about in the right ballpark. A second indication is what we call tax buoyancy. It says if the economy this year expands in nominal terms by 5%, our revenue growth should be at least 5%, because then you are collecting what the economy is producing, because tax is just a factoring of extracting money from the economy. If the economy doesn't grow, your tax take can't grow. And so we have consistently trended a tax buoyancy above 1. Which says we are extracting at a level of efficiency that is generally acceptable. So those would be two indicators. The challenge, though, is we still have a level of compliance of around about 65%. That suggests, and we know that also from the data science and analytical AI work that we do, that not everyone who ought to be registered is registered, and not everyone who is registered fully comply with their obligations. We call that the tax gap. And many studies, including the Davis Tax Commission, estimates the tax gap today, in value terms today, to be somewhere between 350 and 500 billion rand, which says there's still money that is under-recovered from the levels of non-compliance. We also have spoken more publicly about tax that is correctly assessed, that ends up as undisputed debt on the balance sheet of the state, but for various reasons has not been collected. What are some of those reasons? Some of those reasons are just negligence, right? Taxpayers forget that they owe SARS money and they move on. And then you have, and what we see quite a lot of today is a hardship by South Africans who do not dispute the debt, but they just don't have the means to settle the debt. Let me share with you two data points that's quite telling. The one is, in the last year, we have seen a almost threefold increase in the number of requests for debt repayment arrangements. So this is a taxpayer coming to us and say, we know you owe you 1,000 rand. We don't want to run away, but can you give us a repayment plan? And we'll say, yeah, the law allows for us, and you'll enter into that. The second is also an indication of hardship, where a taxpayer may come and say, I'm not disputing the fact that I owe you the debt. I just don't have the means. I've lost my job, or my company has gone insolvent. Can I apply for you to forgive the debt or to compromise the debt? We've seen almost a twofold increase in those. So definitely hardship. And then there are those taxpayers who are just habitually non-compliant and who will do all manner of means to dodge the obligations. And that debt we have said collectively is now in excess of 400 billion because of interest and penalties. But if you just, and this is has been our plea to the Finance Minister to say, if you give us additional resources, even if we can collect just a third of that debt, we could add between 100 and 150 billion rand into the fiscus.
Now, this story is mind-boggling, obviously, when one considers that for the first time there was a VAT increase proposal on the table. If Sars is doing so well in raising revenue, despite these, and I'll come back to these gaps identified by the Davis Tax Committee and all of that, but 7% growth in revenue collection, this morale at SARS that is now improved to well over 70% from very low levels, as it were. I think it's a big gap, but also it seems to me, and we'll get into it, a certain application of new digital technologies, at the center of which is artificial intelligence. How then did it happen that there was a revenue shortfall on the part of National Treasury when you are doing so well? I mean, even at the point at which they let go of the 0.5%, which started higher, then they go for the petrol levy. What are they trying? Let me just put it as broadly as it is. Are you able to take us into confidence what accounts for this contradiction?
It indeed may be many contradictions, Dr. Ndlozi. So, but the first, when I came, let me tell you a little story quickly. When I came home with my first paycheck, it was 20 rand. My dad sat me down.
That must have been in the 1800s.
Long before you, I mean, long before you were born. You know, you celebrated your birthday earlier this month.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Yeah. Thanks.
Reached the golden age of 40.
Yeah. I'm an adult now.
But my dad sat me down and said, firstly, I want to teach you to save. He brought in those years an old mutual insurance salesman, and he said, you buy a policy, you'll take 1.50 rand and you will buy a policy. The second thing he said, avoid debt. And the third lesson, he said, live within your means. Don't spend more than what you have earned. Countries are no different. Countries that really succeed, they do exactly those three things. They save, they don't incur excessive debt, and they live within their means. We have broken all three rules in South Africa.
So has the US.
Well, another lesson.
And China.
So another lesson
the
I
two
learned.
largest economies.
But I'll come to that.
The GDP debt ratio
is. I'll come to that now
tremendous.
Because it's part of living within your means. The reason why the US and countries like China can sustain debt is they have the income production capability. So if you earn 1,000 rand and I earn 500 rand, you can afford a bond that is higher than my bond. If I try and match the house that you buy because I see, well, you bought the house I wanted as well, I can't afford it. So the level of debt is not in absolute terms, it is what debt can you sustain given your earnings. At the moment, our debt level is at 77% of our total GDP, and for a country that has low economic growth, a country that is not building productive capabilities, that's not adding more jobs, it is an unacceptable level of debt, which is why the minister in his fiscal consolidation strategy has said our debt should peak at this year because it is unsustainable. You cannot spend 22 cents of every rand that you spend, not to repay your debt, just to service the interest on the debt.
But is that the reason in your determination for why there was a budget shortfall that had to be accounted for by some increase, in this case the petrol levy, or in the previous budget a VAT increase? Is that your explanation?
So let's look at the first version of the budget, when the minister introduced the 2% increase. In his narrative, which is a reasonable narrative, he says, when my expenditure is growing faster than my income, I can do one of three things. One, I can reduce expenditure. Two, I can borrow more. Three, I can raise taxes. If you evaluate each of those, in a country that's spending 61 cents on every rand for the social wage, which, by the way, in the minister's own words, is a compensation for not growing the economy and creating jobs, we have more and more people reliant on the state. But it is where we are. So 61 cents is not what we wish for. It is what we have to allocate to social wage. Otherwise, people would be destitute. The gogos in the township, the single mothers would have nothing if it weren't for the state monthly grant they get. I always say wealthy people can insure themselves and buy themselves out of poor service delivery, out of natural disasters and pandemics. Poor people can't. They only have the state. And if the state fails them, they are destitute. And so we live with the burden of a high social wage in the country where we are. So the minister says it's hard to reduce expenditure given that. Secondly, I can't borrow any more money because I'm already spending 22 cents to service the debt. So I have no option but to raise taxes. And I had at the time, he said, I have a 60 billion hole. I will fill that with a 2% VAT increase. When SARS entered the conversation, we said to the minister, there's a fourth option, minister. That is, you can improve the efficiency of the tax authority to collect the revenue that's already due to the state. I think over a series of conversations, the minister finally accepted that principle, hence the additional allocation to SARS to collect the additional revenue.
How much is the tax, the increased petrol levy going to contribute? Do you know, just before we go to the headlines, a single figure?
I think it's just over 4 billion.
Okay.
So look.
Are you able to calculate its ripple effect? 4 billion and the consequences in
I think there's
food prices,
it's a coin,
transport prices.
It's a coin with two sides, right?
Okay.
So firstly, we haven't had a fuel levy increase for the last 3 years.
Okay, let me go to the headlines. We'll come back because that's the story with VAT as well. Maybe more than 3 years, in fact. This is Power Talk on Power 987 with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. We're going to take the headlines with Nompumelelo Ngubeni and continue our conversation with the Sars Commissioner. Stay tuned.
Stay informed. Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday on Power 98.7.
Welcome back. This is Power Talk, Bantwana Benkosi. We are with Edward Kieswetter, the Commissioner for the South African Revenue Services for 6 years, 3 weeks now. Commissioner, you are still explaining this debt to GDP ratio as the basis for VAT increase. On the one hand, SARS intervened, and your plea was, if you give us the instruments, the resources, we can raise. And before that, we were just in the break, we were talking about how much illicit financial flows rob the South African economy. This is outside of the 300 billion that is identified by the Davis Tax Committee. You've got about $5 billion that you lose. And in the gold sector, for instance, 77% in the extractive industries is gold. And it's really about misinvoicing. In other sectors as well, a huge part of it is that they misinvoice, because your ultimate calculation of tax is based on the invoice. I want to ask those two questions. It's standard truth now. Long before you came in, there was agreement under the ministerial leadership of Pravin Gordhan. We've got to focus on illicit financial flows. There was an estimation by some of these global bodies that in between 2001 and 2011, about 1 trillion rands was robbed of illicit financial in South Africa alone. You can imagine then, over the years, there's been 3 decades, as it were. Can you address us about that? SARS capacity, particularly your claim to be employing digital technologies. But in this case, it seems to me, you've got to close this specific tax gap caused by illicit financial flows. I know it's an international global phenomena, but what's your efforts in relation to that? So that we don't wake up again from the levy, I don't know what's next.
Well, so the minister has indicated that between now and October, if the project and the commitment of SARS firms up and he has a higher level of confidence in it, he has in the back of his... So we said, Minister, if you give us the additional resources, we think we could raise at the lower end 20 billion extra revenue per year, at the outer end up to 50. He has said in the back of his mind, and he would have picked it up in his speech, that he has in the back of his mind a number of about 35 billion. Mm-hmm. If that materializes, it takes a significant pressure off the minister to introduce any further taxes. Mm-hmm. That's the challenge to us. Hence the additional focus on the recovery of debt that's already due to the state, as well as a focus on over 50 million outstanding returns by taxpayers who've just not bothered to file, and we've not always had the capacity to follow that up. Mm-hmm. Coming to the tax gap, so the number, as I said earlier on, is between 350 to 500. It's theoretical, so it's hard to give an exact number. We always give a range.
From the Davis Tax Committee. Yeah.
And other studies confirms that. Mm-hmm. Within that, the largest leakage is VAT. Because VAT is firstly, it's a self-administered tax, and it is a tax that straddles across the value chain from the supply of raw materials to the sale of finished goods. So you have to almost instrument the entire value chain in order to really administer VAT correctly. One of our big projects in modernization is to modernize the entire VAT administration platform. Let me just share a couple of phenomena where there is the abuse of the VAT administration. The first is when you export things from South Africa out of the country, there's an incentive on the exporter to overstate the value of the goods, because the value of goods, or rather the VAT rate for exported goods, is 0. So instead of saying something is 50, you try and send it out at the value of 100, because that means you can arbitrage the VAT refund. That's one phenomenon. A second phenomenon is on goods that you import, you understate the value because you pay VAT on goods that you import in addition to customs duty. A third area of abuse in the VAT system is we find an incredible number of entities who register for VAT with no intention to trade, and they do so purely because they want to have access to the VAT refund system. And you find these organizations live for about 3 to 5 months, then they disappear, and then they come up in another form. So these are some of the areas. Just last year, we were able to prevent over 100 billion of refunds, a significant portion of that with VAT refunds, that we were able to stop because they were impermissible or just fraudulent. So VAT is 200 billion. It's the largest component.
Let me ask a direct question, because you gave us an hour. So, instruments to stop that on the one hand. Being SARS, you've got this capacity to go into an entity's past and say, there are all these studies. You can zoom into 10 or 20 of them and say, we're going to review your transactions over the last 10 to 15 years. You owe us this much, retrospectively. I'm asking if that can be done, if you are doing it, but also to what you call modernizing with a specific target of these industries. They are well known. In South Africa, extractive industries are a big tax avoider, and they're eroding our tax base. Wouldn't that call for this specific focus? Maybe when it comes to them, you change this rule of zero tax on exports, for an example, because they are, over the last many decades, from different observers that are not just South African, engaged in I think it's criminal manipulation of our VAT system.
Let me just make a few points about the mandate of SARS. We cannot witch hunt. We cannot just say we're going to troll through your last 10 years of records without cause.
Isn't these studies cause?
So the first thing is we have to establish cause.
Why haven't you?
Because we often sit with data asymmetry. Taxpayers disclose the data that they feel they want to increasingly that has been aided. We have been aided by increasingly improving the exchange of data. So, for example, we now have significantly more efficient exchange of data protocol and practices between banks, both locally and with over 100 international banks, that we get an automatic exchange of data for taxpayers who have financial assets abroad. So we can track the flow of money when taxpayers are
Are accounting firms part of these institutions? Because they would be the brains, the machinery to help these big multinational corporations in the extractive industry. My target is the extractive industry because that's our wealth.
Yes.
That is the only thing South Africa really naturally has to become a better country. Others, we have to work extra hard. But the extractive industries would be assisted by accounting firms.
So if you take the gold industry, for example, and you're quite right? So there has sadly been a secondary industry in gold created to abuse the tax system, where there is a gold refining industry that has, by the way, created a criminal activity to steal finished gold products. There's scary stories of people who track when you buy gold jewelry. They know exactly where you are. They get information by enablers who work within these firms, and they so know you have a certain amount. So there's an industry that either legally or criminally gather finished gold and then refines it, melts it down into ingots, and then present it as gold that has been refined from mining. And they then take that and trade it using the VAT arbitrage that is available for it. So that's just the gold industry. There's, in the fuel industry, there's the adulteration of fuel. So, we take a very practical example. Paraffin has a lower duty than diesel because the simple logic is households use paraffin and industries use diesel. So in the last 6 years in South Africa, we found a fundamental reshaping of the fuel industry landscape. From about 6 or 7 majors who brought in fuel, we had the NatRef, the SAPREFs that had refining. Our refining capacity is all but gone. And so we found over 450 in the last 6 years of additional operators that have entered the fuel trading, buying and selling, storing and manufacturing of fuel. Included in that is what we call fuel adulteration, where you would blend paraffin with diesel and then present it as diesel to get the higher claim. And so there's all kinds of these shenanigans. That's the fuel industry. So I've spoken about the gold, I've spoken about the fuel, and this happens because the compliance landscape has completely, it was easy to track 6 majors. It's now harder to track 450 operators, right? But to come back to another example that we live with every day, companies have to apply for an advance payment request to the Reserve Bank when they buy goods and services overseas. These providers will say, give us an advance payment to secure your order. And you would find that an advance payment application for 100 million is approved. When the goods come in, it has to be declared for customs purposes. And that good is then declared at 80. Effectively, it means it is an illicit outflow of 20 million rand. And so we work hard with the Reserve Bank to correlate all approvals for advance payments with customs declarations that come in.
So,
ultimately, the thing that gives you integrity, because data science is reliant on the quality of data, and that's where our biggest challenge lies.
Let me make an example, just a final push here on illicit financial outflows. At some point, you identified that there's a lot of illicit trading in cigarettes, and there was an effort with regards to that. This is a targeted effort. I'm saying there is prima facie evidence from a plethora of studies by credible bodies that you've got in the extractive industries in particular. I know bank and other financial institutions may be complicit themselves, but so why not say, in the same way you did with cigarettes, and unless I'm missing something, we're going to have a special concerted effort because there is a revenue leakage of decades and decades on the one hand, but also significant amounts of money due to South Africa.
It's just the complexity there. Let me give you the example that you've chosen. We had to deal with over 60 terabytes of data. We went to a forensic firm and said, can you analyze this data for us and give us a report? They charged us 100 million rand. We don't have the 100 million rand, so we employed 9 of our own people to work through this. It took them 3 years to work through this, to finally bust that syndicate.
Of cigarettes?
The cigarette and gold syndicate. It took us 3 years to just collect and connect the dots. So it's complex work. It's work that requires deep data science and forensic analysis skills. It's work that then requires very, very smart forensic investigators and auditors to get to this. These aren't people, Dr. Ndlozi, that sit there and welcome you when you come to them. They're not people who say, oh, you've raised the 4 billion rand assessment at me. When is it due? I'd like to pay. They defend their position. They double down. They fight us in court. Because not only is it a huge financial risk to them, in many cases they face criminal charges, whether it is an importer that brings in goods and services here or just cross-border trade in the tobacco and gold industry. So let me share with you that we created a vision that looks at syndicated crime. We have about 250 people of that, of which probably 150 are hands-on investigators and auditors. We could do with a body of auditors of 1,000 just to deal with the level of abuse and criminal proliferation that we see. And by the way, as you said out, when I speak to my colleagues around the world, their top concerns, in addition to the rapid need to digitalize and to deploy AI and an aging workforce, the two big issues that are existential is a growing debt liability that remains uncollected and the proliferation of cross-border crime.
Yeah.
We simply are under-resourced to deal with these issues.
Just the two concluding questions. One is these conditions on social grants, the new ones, which some of the experts say will actually exclude or render a lot of social grant recipients finding it difficult to access social grants, and there's rising levels of poverty and malnutrition as the first set of questions. This question of the black tax, what's wrong with treating a... I'll give you an example. I was the first to get matric in my family. My grandmother had 12 children.
Tick for me.
I'm the grandchildren. I'm in the grandchildren level. I was the first or the second, but certainly the first who grew up under her household. By the time I went to work, I think you can calculate. I work a little bit. You tax me the same way you tax another, whether black, white, or Indian, or colored, it doesn't matter, with a certain property base that they move from. But also including those things of tax brackets, they don't take into consideration that I need more money to dispense than the child of Kieswetter. Even when I get the pensions, there's normally no consider, is that do I get a pension of 2 million? You take a lot of it, the same way you would a person that already has paid their house and all of that. Take us through those two questions from a point of view of sort of uplifting the middle class out of networks that they take care of in relation to financial dependency and these conditions of social grants that seemingly pose this threat to social grants recipients, including the social relief grant.
One day when we have time, I must tell you the Kieswetter story.
And you must just create it. I've got the time.
And you'll realize that the Kieswetter story is not very different from Ndlozi's story.
Okay.
And I am a big contributor to black tax, by the way.
Fair enough.
But put that aside for a moment. Let me just deal with the first issue of raising the bar for people who have access to the social grant system. It's unfortunately necessary because of the level of abuse that it is exposed to. So people are recipients of social old age pensions or other grants that do not qualify for it, including the social relief of distress grant. And so there's a need again to make sure that those who apply do not double dip. Our system at the moment in South Africa is disconnected. One of the more longer term fixes that we are advocating, we're working with Home Affairs to do that, as well as the Reserve Bank, is to create a unique digital identity, like many countries like Singapore has, which means anywhere where you pop up in the system, there's only one version of you. In South Africa, there can be several versions of you because you have different identifiers. So that's the longer term fix. In the interim, what we need is data matching to make sure when Kieswetter applies for a unemployment or a social grant or a NSFAS, that he is not also a recipient, or rather on the pay-as-you-earn system of Sars, earning R1 million a year, because that would be the abuse. So the data matching is trying to fill a short-term deficiency in the system that is disconnected.
But
why
not perfect that first before you ask recipients, as it were, to show this cause?
It's not an either or, it's doing both. Because in the meantime, you would, if you're an honest contributing taxpayer, you would want to know that the use of that money goes to a cause that is deserving or worthy. And at least worthy and deserving may be subjective, so let me use a more objective thing that meets the criteria objectively. Let me deal with
the black middle class.
The black middle class. So unfortunately,
it's actually a huge population of taxpayers.
We need a show just on the black middle class, right? But let me first say the question is above my pay grade because I don't formulate tax policy. For example, let me share with you a very personal gripe I have. We have many waiters in South Africa who pay tax on their tips. Now, this is a career limiting statement for me to make. The question has to be asked. They already earn so little money. How do you still tax?
And it's precarious money.
Yeah. How do you still... And and the sad part is it's open to abuse because now instead of paying your tip through your credit card, you pay your bill through your credit card and give the waiter, the 50 or 100 in cash because it's then outside of the system. So it's unintended application of a law that does not differentiate between, it is progressive, so it differentiates between levels of income. It doesn't differentiate for life circumstances. And so it treats the single guy who earns 100 Rand exactly as the other guy who earns 100 Rand but has to feed 10 people. I guess the reason for a good public debate about that is that any tax system should be equitable. It should be reflective, because if not, it does create inadvertently the opportunity to undermine it. And therefore, I think it's a healthy and very active discussion that has to be had. But ultimately, it's the policymakers, in this case, the Minister of Finance, that must apply his or her mind, hopefully in the future, to a question of how do you differentiate in a more equitable manner, and not just the progressivity, but also the equity that a tax system should have.
Are you sure I can keep you for 30 minutes?
You can keep me for a little bit while longer.
Okay. Let's take the news. It's 1000 hours with Nyaka Lotefu, and then we're going to tease out this black tax situation a little bit more. This is Power Talk with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. Matefu Ditaba.
This is Power 98.7. And now you're listening to Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. 9 a.m. to midday, taking your calls on 0861 987 000.
We are back, and by the amazing grace of the revenue collector, we have been granted the 30 minutes to go on with Mr. Kieswetter for an additional discussion on SARS. If you would like to ask one or two questions, I do have a moment. 0861987000. It's our studio line. It will be better, in fact, even more helpful, if you could send voice note 0833037093. And this is important. Commissioner, I wanted for you to expand in a much more systemic way this black middle class condition. As a black man yourself, you have the experience of 100 Rand in the 18 dependents. At first, none of which are your children, but they are dependents. But 100 Rand that comes to somebody whose mother or father and grandmother had been in the system for a while means that it's really as much as possible for themselves. Can the tax system take that into consideration? If so, what would it look like for revenue collection?
Firstly, tax is a blunt instrument. And the way that various situations, not just the black tax issue, but various situations have been accommodated, or at least an attempt to accommodate circumstances and to incentivize certain behavior or disincentivize other behavior, in theory, sometimes sounds workable. In practice, it doesn't. Let me give one or two examples. So rather than a differential tax system, which is complex to administer, tax systems worldwide, but in South Africa, has sought to give other support. So, for example, the zero rating of VAT of certain products is one way of saying VAT is 15%, but we'll exclude certain products because this is income support for poor people. It works well on paper. It doesn't always work well in practice. Let me give you a simple example. My mother, bless her soul, we laid her to rest a month ago.
Condolences.
I would argue with her that...
Oh, I recall. That's how you missed our previous confirmed interview.
Yes. I always had to argue with her that brown bread is healthier than white bread. But she prefers the softness and the texture of white bread, so she would buy white bread. We call it square bread. My helper is the same, prefers white bread. So we zero rate brown bread, but actually it's not poor people that buy brown bread. It's health conscious people. It doesn't pan out as a relief for the poorest people. It turns out to be a relief for health conscious people. That's one example. We have other incentives through the tax system for accelerated depreciation to incentivize the investment into capital goods. It turns out that it is hardly enough to replace a solid business case where the commercial dynamics will attract an investment. So tax is hardly the most efficient way to accommodate various circumstances. So on the tax policy system, it would be far too complex a system to administer, because again you have the arbitrage and the abuse of who really qualifies and who don't. The response to that, to provide some level of equity, is through income support for lower income families. The issue of wealth tax, by the way, which is another thing I think we should openly discuss, because there's often a lot of energy behind that. How should the wealthy be taxed is an important question, a relevant question, but you also inadvertently don't want to cut off your nose to spite your face. And so it's not just about introducing a wealth tax, it's about how do you redefine the taxing of the wealth so that you tax it appropriately. So for me, it would make a good scholarly but also a good debate in society to talk about how else can we re-engineer taxing system, which by its very design is not efficient.
If post, like when you do your claims, if you could demonstrate that my 100 rand, I pay 4 to 7 school fees, none of which are my children. I pay this and that in the house I don't stay in because it's my grandmother's house. I buy these groceries. If you could demonstrate all of that in the current arrangement, that wouldn't relieve me. That wouldn't reduce the amount. It wouldn't get me some tax rebate in any manner. I mean, at that level, and it would, in this case, in as much as it benefits majority of the black middle class because of this structural inefficiency historically, quite frankly. And I mean black people, I'm speaking about Africans, I'm speaking about colored people, I'm speaking about Indian people. It would include these poor whites who keep following the white identity when they are propertyless, when they are actually living in the maybe 1 or 2% of them. Certainly the 49 that went to the US, but because why would you go to United States and live like a refugee instead of fighting crime to protect your property? But my point is, at that level, isn't the conversation at that level that yes, leave the tax brackets, but if I come back in my filing and say, this is how I'm expanding of this salary, it's consistent over 12 months, I'm taking care of people here, I should be able to get relief.
There was a time, and you're far too young for this, when the tax system allowed for certain rebates, including the number of dependents you had. you had certain rebates. In an attempt to simplify the system over the years, a lot of these rebates that are complicated, hard to administer, and easy to abuse have been engineered out of it. But our tax system was largely also designed in a pre-democracy era. And every year we have had, for as long as I've been in tax, and this is now for almost 3 decades, there has been this quest to simplify tax codes. Let me give you an example which doesn't answer the black tax question, but we have introduced a turnover tax. And this would largely be black people in South Africa, given our socio-historic context, to make it easier for small business people, for vendors, to administer the tax and somehow reduce their overall tax burden. The opportunity, the take-up has been dismal, because somehow people would prefer to stay outside of the net than use what we think is a more preferential policy. I really think, and I would invite a broader debate with people smarter than myself into a table like this to say, how do we rethink taxation for South Africans as if we started afresh, given our historical history, given our current structural inequalities and inequities, and the need to advance the well-being of all South Africans. I think it certainly justifies a robust debate.
This leads us to the artificial intelligence, digital technologies. If you could address us about what is Sars' plan there? There's lots of tax leakages, particularly identified as well. Well, this is a standard truth for most people who interact with procurement departments in municipalities that are able, at this moment, by the way, to raise a lot of money with regards to payment of specifically these small business contractors and service providers. They are able to say, withhold a payment of an invoice and then say, you're going to give me 10%. If you don't, they will dry you out, not pay you until you get out of the system and your business dies. Can you tell us about digital technology instruments which will help with regards to these procurement leakages that generally lead to, forms of expenditure that are not wanted? On the other, clear corruption, misinvoicing, and at that level, where a person says a can of Coke is 30 Rand when they actually buy it with 12.50 Rand because they are buying it by government money. But also, if this earlier point about a single system where I have one identity as Mbuyiseni, whether I go to Sars, whether I go to Home Affairs, or I go to Sars, my profile is alive to a single source, which will help maybe then that my information, when I submit it about my dependents and all of that, the system is able to say, indeed, this person's tax is overwhelmed.
So there's a couple of things. Let me make 3 points about how we would enable more integrity in the system, and then share with you how we deploy data science and AI. And not to forget, also prepare our people to work in a AI-enabled future, because that's the other risk we face if we don't consider how do we take people along with us. On the enabling side, so we've mentioned the one that is strengthening the integrity of the system by having a unique digital identifier that you can't arbitrage or present yourself. I think in South Africa, for every juristic person, every natural person, I've heard a stat, there can be up to 7 times of digital identities that exist for you. And so that's a huge problem that weakens the integrity of the system. The second thing, and we learned this from the Brazilian example of introducing a instant payment system, electronic digital payment system, to achieve 2 things. Firstly, improve the financial inclusion and secondly, to reduce the volume of cash in the system, because cash is a significant way to mask the flow of money and the store of money. From the Brazilians, we've learned that they've increased their financial inclusion into the 90% and reduced cash from about 77% to the low 40%. And this is about a year ago when I looked at it closely. So we are working with the Reserve Bank leading this, to build an instant payment system. But to make that work, it has to be as easy and convenient as cash, and for the user, it must be as free as cash, because cash transactions has no transactional cost, whereas electronic transactions often do. And so this is one of the and near free for the service providers on the platform, and then importantly, also to then create a digital currency that coexists within the payment system. So to summarize, the first is a digital identity that's unique. The second is a payment system that can mimic cash in terms of its ease of use and its cost of use, but for a higher level of integrity, low risk of theft and loss is the system they're working towards. The third enabling issue is just data symmetry. What countries who have done well is they've created a single portal to access all data, and every entity, obviously with data segregation, can only see the data they're entitled to in terms of their mandate, but they have a single version of the truth. If you have multiple versions of the truth, it's hard to have a system with high integrity.
Like a person can be described to have engaged in some serious corrupt activities through company X in a municipality, be sort of banned from doing business there, and then go to the next municipality and function.
Yeah. So one of the things we are doing...
Or was a municipal manager in municipality X, DC excluded, go to the next municipality,
you just
and
pop up
get the
again.
job. Yeah.
And you create a new entity. So one of the things, in addition to a unique digital identifier, is to mandate beneficial ownership, so that I can't mask my economic ownership from my legal ownership. So I can create a company that I give it XYZ as a name, but actually Kieswetter is the beneficial owner, pretending to be XYZ as a company. What the law has now mandated, and it's one of the things, by the way, that was a FATF requirement, is that every entity that is registered as a trust or as a business entity must be direct access to the beneficial ownership. It's what we call piercing the corporate veil. Let me turn quickly to how we use data science at the moment. Many people think that we use data science to catch crooks, but actually the biggest deployment of data science is to provide a better service to taxpayers.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a practical use case of that. But we use it for four things. The first is we use data, that which we can harvest from different sources. We use it to risk profile every individual and every entity, because to the extent that there are areas of non-compliance, you present a risk to the fiscus, so we talk about risk profiling. Secondly, we use data science and AI to decide on the cases we select for further investigation. There's no subjectivity in it. Kieswetter doesn't wake up this morning and says, I'm going to audit Ndlozi.
Because I'm the commissioner.
Or I don't like Ndlozi,
Yeah.
for any reason. All of that, I, for example, am completely outside of any risk profile or case selection. I don't get involved in any technical tax matter. So that's the second area. Risk profiling the first, case selection the second. The third is case assessment. And then the last is fraud risk detection. So those are the four areas where we deploy data science. Risk profiling, case selection, case resolution, and fraud risk detection. Let me give you a practical example. We have 8 million individual taxpayers who have a filing obligation. In 2007, 97% of taxpayers would have given us a paper return, which we would have to capture, edit, go back, say you've left out a field. that meant that an assessment would typically take 6 months. Today, we have most of our returns that we receive is received digitally, which allows us to give you an assessment in under 5 seconds.
And
Just look at that.
What's the percentage difference now?
Well, it was 97% in 2007. Today, we have 60% of those taxpayers
happening digitally.
don't know. They don't even have to submit a return. We've disintermediated the need for them to submit a return purely because we can use data that we get from third parties, asset registers, banks and others, as well as then deploying AI on it. So in the case of our 8 million, for 5 million people don't have to do anything. They get an SMS from us. They say, this is your assessment. If you're happy, your refund will be in your bank account in under 72 hours, which, by the way, used to be almost 2 months. Right? Then we also said, for those who do submit a return, by the way, which is most of the balance, except for about, of the 8 million, probably about 500,000, come to our branches. And even those who come to our branches, we terminate the paper right there. In other words, we'll take your forms, we'll capture you online, and you take the paper away. So effectively, 100% of filing is done digitally or not at all. The few who come in, we facilitate the digitization of the return immediately. So we've gone from 97% paper to practically completely digital.
1 minute again.
Just one last point.
Okay.
So whilst creating such a super service where 5 million people don't have to submit return, the 3 million who do get an assessment in under 3 seconds. We do all of that whilst at the same time we have prevented last year the outflow of impermissible refunds, because every return has a potential refund of over 100 billion rand.
If every single department, municipality, state entity digitizes by law or by Sars, you've got those, I don't know what you call it, some rules you impose on them, that you must have a digital procurement system by such and such a date, all of you. Wouldn't it make it easy then to monitor the abuse of state funds and these revenue leaks in the next 3 to 5 years? If you were to say, all of you by this time, your procurement system must be digitized, then here we use this at SARS. You can either do this or make a case for a better digital technological system, data system. But by this time, you must do that. And wouldn't it make it easy not only to save tax money, but to accelerate clean service delivery?
So we are a huge proponent of the digitization of the state and the deployment of AI for exactly the reason you point out. We can't mandate it, however, because there are other mandating agencies in government. But we work with the presidency to certainly use SARS as a case study and to contribute towards the digitalization of the state. I think that's important. I think we have a long way to go. But the good news is this is not like we are trying to split the atom or land someone on Mars. It is actually quite doable. What we need is strong political will, the right strategic leadership at a technical and leadership level to drive this, and the allocation of the resources that will enable it.
Kieswetter, Mr. Kieswetter, SARS Commissioner. SARS stands for South African Revenue Services. And as the Bible says, give to the taxman what belongs to the taxman. Thanks very much for creating time and for also the 30 minutes extension. Are you coming back as the SARS Commissioner?
I'm an old man, Dr. Ndlozi. Huh?